So what is going on, Metaverse? Animositas here with another episode of Annie Knows, and I'm very pleased to be joined today by a special guest. Mr. Santiago Santos is joining us today, and he is an OG investor in the Web3 space. So Santi started with DeFi projects, including some work with Aave and MakerDAO and others. He's also been highly active in Web3 gaming, and in this case, funded dozens of Web3 projects, including things like Illuvium, which is where we had initially met. As I like to think of him, he's one of the godfathers of Web3 gaming on the path to decentralization. So, Santi, it's a pleasure to have you here.
Well, thank you very much for the kind introduction. You're making me blush over here, but yeah, it's great to be here. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, and certainly this is an amazing time for us to be recording. We're less than 1 week before the ETH merge, and for anyone that's been in the space, this has been a long time coming. On top of that, there are dozens of Web3 gaming projects that you and I follow that have major launches, mints, alpha, beta versions that are coming up here in September. I know you took some time off this summer, so do you feel like things are picking back up?
Yeah, definitely. During the summer, I didn't see many teams. And now it's felt like I'm seeing a lot. I've met new teams that are building across gaming, NFT infrastructure, DeFi, and it's really exciting. Like as I was saying earlier, I think the most important metric for me in this space has been human capital and the talent that continues to come to Web3, even given market conditions, is pretty powerful. It continues to be stronger. Like, I think it keeps getting stronger and stronger. And maybe it's a function because of your top talent engineer at Google, maybe, or some other startup, maybe your restricted stock units are worth less, because, public markets have taken a hit. And so maybe the opportunity cost is lower. But I genuinely think that, even talking like with folks like Noor, like with Brooks from Noor and some of these other founders that have been super successful, and don't necessarily have to come and build. But I think really smart people are drawn to open source movements, and that collective spirit and building in the open and is really powerful and attracts the smartest people. And smart people want to work with other smart people, and so it's really interesting, and it's a very resilient space. Anyone that says that crypto is dead isn't part of Discord channels, isn't part of the discussion or the community. And I get it. Sometimes community takes a very fluffy sense of the word and it's perhaps overused. But, I think if you genuinely spend time in this Discord channels, the access that you can have to way smarter people, and just if you're someone that is intellectually curious, the learning curve is very steep in crypto. It can be daunting at times because I'm not an engineer, for instance, but you can learn a lot, and it's you never stop learning here. And I think in other industries, I've done a lot of things before crypto, and I just felt that at some point, kind of the marginal, just sort of the learning curve, it flattens out at some point. But in crypto, I think it's a function of we're so early, and there's so many problems that haven't been solved, and that's the really exciting part. A lot of people look at that and say, well, crypto's not going to work. You haven't really developed interesting use cases. And part of that is true. Like that, I think that criticism I sympathize with and I agree with partially. But I think it misses the point, because ultimately, who would have imagined a smartphone back in, 2002? Heck, in 2002, most people were like even dismissive of the internet. And like, here we are, right? We've come a long way, software as a service, smartphones, and everything that, has, and all the different use cases that a device like a smartphone, like the iPhone, has enabled. And I think like you sort of have to believe that is going to be true in this case, and perhaps even faster, because all of this movement is open source, and the compounding effects of that are pretty powerful. The composability effects and how you're able to integrate with an entire financial ecosystem called DeFi. And you can come and build, and it's super lightweight, and you can build protocols much faster. But yeah, like I think this movement is super exciting, and I think anyone that is critical, we should always be critical, but not necessarily cynical. I think there's a difference between the two. We should always be very self-policing and trying to fix the things that are not working. And I think we know that. I mean, in this, especially in bear markets, like it's time to reflect and say, okay, what really did we not do right the last cycle? What can we do better? And I think that's why in this environment, when you ask me, like, this is what I like about this current state, which is you can slow down a bit, you can take a breather, you can zoom out and say, okay, we should probably fix XYZ to set ourselves up for the next real wave. And I love gaming because I think you've seen really early indications of, pretty Yankee, like not, it's pretty, like the games are not like at the quality of Web2 games. The experience is kind of a little bit fragmented and not as fluid as we would want. But I think it's if games like Axie can be that successful, and sure, you can look at the token design and the economics and the economy there, and rightfully so, like not very sustainable, but nonetheless, put that aside for a minute. But if you combine like digital ownership and the idea of kind of playing and earning, but also I think, and how successful that was combined with like the whole movement of like NFTs and digital ownership, you sort of believe that there's going to be a game out there that is going to be at feature parity with Web 2 in the next 5 years.
Mm-hmm.
And because you're seeing founders that have been super successful in developing like Web 2 games saying, hey, I like this. And I want to build here. And then at some point over the next 3 to 5 years, there's going to be 1, 2, 3, 5, maybe 10 super hit games and game studios in crypto that are going to take us mainstream. And so it's really exciting.
Yeah. I think the exactly what you mentioned with Axie, the challenge that we saw in this wave 1 of Web3 games is the builders there went from the model of having no ownership of your in-game assets is a bad thing, which I think is the right starting premise. But they swung the pendulum all the way over to the other side, and assumed therefore the opposite is being able to earn and have essentially a job replacement, which is clearly the other side of the spectrum. But I don't think you have to go that far to see a product that's purely better than Web2 gaming, right? Just having pure ownership of your own assets is good enough. They don't have to become investment grade, little blobs on the screen, or long swords of slaying or land plots. As long as you own something, that's a good enough start to get us to beyond parity with Web 2, as long as the quality is there in the games. And for sure, this first version has been, in my mind, more of a gamified version of DeFi protocols. But I think the second wave that we see, with a lot of the projects that we've talked about, be they, I'm not going to mention all of them, but we're heavily involved in Illuvium and Nor and a lot of these other projects. They're actually building meaningful content, games that you would play even if there were no earnings behind them. And so I agree. I think that's the most exciting part to see in this space.
Absolutely.
With that in mind, what do you hear from a lot of these founders that you interact with as the biggest challenges that they're dealing with right now?
Historically, one of the biggest challenges has been getting talented like Unity developers and finding them. I think the market for talent was very competitive, particularly over the last 12 months. I think now it's starting to be more opportunistic, and you're starting to get talent. People I think are transitioning jobs and or coming into the space. And I think it's a function of a lot of these games have been fortunate enough to have raised and are well capitalized to kind of endure and build over the next 2-3 years and have that runway and capacity to hire really top notch people. And so I think what I found to be true is a lot of engineers and really, while they're very smart and motivated, they're also somewhat risk averse. But if you have a team that is very well capitalized and has raised a round from really good investors, that HR currency is really powerful. And I think a lot of Web3 games are in that fortunate position. And so I think now, so that has been a challenge, hiring. I think that is becoming, probably easier on the margin. The other one is thinking about which L1 and or L2 to deploy, whether it's Immutable or Polygon or Avalanche or Solana. I think that conversation is going to continue to probably be front and center as games think about, okay, where can we actually deploy? What kind of guarantees can we have from the core team of these L1s or L2s? And I think there are some technical kind of deficits no matter what you look at. I mean, there is like a great blog post, screenshot actually, from the Helium team, for instance, that abandoned their own initiative to build their own L1 and then migrated over to Solana, and they kind of did a very thorough analysis of why. So I would encourage founders to go and take a look at that and maybe even talk to the Helium team. Helium is not a game; it's different, obviously. But I think that is top of mind for a lot of folks. It's like, okay, we're building the game, we're very focused on it, but hey, at some point we're going to have to make a decision of which chain to deploy on. And maybe the answer is we'll just build our own. That is also possible, and I think we'll see a few games once they get meaningful traction to just like DYDX, obviously in DeFi land has done. Just said, hey, look, we're sort of abandoning Ethereum and we're going to build our own. And so that's probably the second one. And the third is on the margin. Just this uncertainty, lack of clarity on the regulatory side. I think if you're a game, it's probably less on the frontier and on the risk spectrum as DeFi protocols. But still, as you said, some of these games have kind of DeFi elements to them, and I think that is goes back to what we were discussing before we started. This is that uncertainty is just takes up headspace, and so I hope and I'm optimistic that whatever the clarity and whatever the outcome is, it will be nice and refreshing to have a clear framework and on the regulatory side of things. And I was just thinking about this yesterday, in part inspired by a tweet from Sam from FTX, which said, hey, probably a lot of these tokens are going to be securities. And I don't want to dive too much on the side of security on regulation because A, I'm not an expert. B, none of this is legal or financial advice.
Yes.
But I do think about that because I think it is, think about how much time and resources go towards trying to get it right on the regulatory side of things. And look, I tend to believe that most of the teams or all of the teams that I invest in are trying to do the right thing, i.e., the spirit of the law has always been, hey, let's have fair, transparent markets that, have consumer protection, right? No one likes to be, rugged or be part of scams, but unfortunately they happen in crypto and in other markets. And so I think the spirit of the law has been that, creating safe, transparent, high integrity kind of environments and I think, look, a lot of what has held up crypto has been that, you talk to a lot of institutions, you talk to a lot of users, how many people are on the sidelines saying, I just need clarity. And when that happens, okay, but I don't, it just feels, and so I think a lot of it is priced in. And so as I'm hopeful and optimistic that we can get to a sensible solution where, look, if it's you need to register as a security, okay, well, just give me a good framework. Because I do think the law needs to kind of adapt to kind of this new paradigm where you keep the intent of the law absolutely the same, but maybe think about it this way. Public companies, okay, register as securities, you have investment banks that, you disclose all the risks. There's an audit. There's the information and the way you present information is kind of, there's a standard, and then you report it on the, Edgar SEC website, and there's 8Ks and 10Ks and 10Qs and all this kind of reporting. But the nice thing is, when you think about it, blockchains are data rich and immutable,
Fully visible. Yeah.
Immutable, fully visible. And so is it really that burdensome? No, you just create an API where you scrub, you're constantly inspecting the blockchain. Look at a block explorer, that immutable data set that you can package and process and scan that information and then report it in a very transparent manner. You're already kind of doing that. Second piece is, if you're a token issuer, and you want to get listed on some of these exchanges, some do different levels of diligence, but anecdotally, some exchanges do very thorough due diligence on the project. Who are the investors? What are the vesting schedules? And so, because they obviously want to protect their users, and so I think in many ways they're kind of good gatekeepers because you're kind of registering with them to list the token on the exchange. And so, if we as an industry kind of band together, then maybe the exchanges become, kind of the information gatekeepers. The SEC just started its own department for crypto information disclosures. And so I'm pretty optimistic on that front. But yeah, that would be the third, not to rumble too much on regulation, but I hope that, we can get some good clarity over the next 6-12 months and really set ourselves up to just unlock so much energy that has been trapped. And as opposed to spending on legal fees and lawyers, you actually devote that to innovation.
building something meaningful for sure. And I agree. I think we had a short exchange on Twitter yesterday about this point. And I think that the Howey test from a US standpoint is a difficult one to try and interpret when you're thinking about Web3 gaming. I liken this to using like a blacksmith's hammer to try and craft a laser, right? Where you're using a tool that was built in the 1940s and adjudicated, really in that time period. I'm trying to figure out how you should apply this to a virtual world. And we didn't even have transistors back then, much less the concept of a Web3 video game. So some of those basic principles that you talk about, I think, are exactly the right feedback. We need transparency. We need openness and consistency in reporting. The main pieces that I see, though, are figuring out for the sake of the founders and the builders here, what can and can they not do from a token structure standpoint, to still be doing the right thing for their players, because you don't want to have an 8-year-old who's going in and playing Illuvium land, and he's now running afoul of securities regulation, because this is not something that I think anyone wants to be put in that place of. So we need to have those clear guidelines so that the builders can take those and actually build within the framework of the law and the regulation. So
absolutely,
fully agree. Yeah. So I think it's an interesting point of something that needs to be evolving in the future. I want to touch base on one of the hot topics that I've been pulled into some discussions on lately, which is DAOs, and specifically in the context of Web3 gaming. So I think that I'm right by saying that you, along with Kieran, are the longest serving members of the Illuvium Council. And I know you've been involved in Maker and a number of other DAOs really since the early days in Web3. What do you see as far as value efficiencies that DAOs are providing to Web3 gaming? And how do you see those needing to evolve into maybe a version 2? So maybe make the arguments for and against DAOs in Web3 games specifically.
Yeah, I think to set the stage, so what is working and not working for DAOs in the current form? I think it's a very exciting, some people call it like the native corporation LLC of the internet, which is easy to kind of set up. And a lot of these DAOs have been set up, to make governance decisions on certain parameters of protocols. And some are like Compound's different than Aave, than Maker, than Illuvium. But nonetheless, I think the core premise is virtually the same, which is if you're a token holder, you have some share of voting power to be part of the discussion and then kind of vote on certain things. So I think like Compound is like one end of the spectrum, which is anyone can put forth a proposal which has an accompanying code if you're going to make an upgrade to an Oracle, for instance. And then if it gets voted on and passed, it's just sort of like, you change the protocol in a very meaningful way. In others, it's more on the other end of the spectrum. It could be a little bit of a theater, which is, for instance, the Rari Fay kind of voting on reimbursing hack, users that lost certain funds in the hack was a good example of a broken kind of governance, which was something was passed, it wasn't honored, and it just became this sort of idea. It's like, well, what are we really here for?
Right.
In my interactions with governance, I think that there is this assumption that it is great that anyone in the community can opine and be vocal and express their own opinions, because you feel like you're, perhaps more than a typical shareholder in traditional markets, that you feel like you're part of the early days, like you have some sense of ownership and part of, I guess, the team. But that's not to say that, like, at the end of the day, there needs to be some hierarchy, because things need to get done at the end of the day. And there is this dynamic of really vocal minorities in any political system, in any kind of society, which is sometimes there are very vocal minorities that don't necessarily represent the majority view, but they can be very distracting. And so I think this is one of the things that, ultimately, I think there needs to be some clarity around. There's absolutely going to have to be more hierarchy to a lot of these DAOs, because to assume that you're going to be able to coordinate capital and actually get stuff done without hierarchy, just give me an example historically where this has worked. Now, the nice thing is anyone can elect, for instance, at Illuvium in the council. If you're not doing stuff right, and you're not showing up to meetings, and you're not voting, and people don't like that, and the overwhelming majority is you're not like representing the common good, and you can, I guess, argue what the common good is. But if you're not like, and the community doesn't like you, you're not going to get reelected.
Mm-hmm.
As easy as that. And so we have shorter epochs for that reason. Like we have, initially it was 3 months, and now I think we were talking about making it perhaps longer, 6 months. But that's the nice thing about this, is like what you vote on is very public, and there's a greater share of accountability in DAOs. And I think that's a nice thing, because a community is policing, is constantly, you need to, when I vote on something on the council, I need to explain why and why I did it. And I feel like that's like a little bit better, because look, democracies are great, but they really need active civic participation, and this is where I think a lot of like politicians are not very accountable. Like they get elected, they're going to be there for 4 years or 6 years. And at some point they just kind of like, they lose sight, I think, of their constituents. And a lot of it is because maybe their constituents are not really on top of them.
Mm-hmm.
Now, a lot of times that could be true or not. And so anyways, I'm saying all this because I think like DAOs will need more in order to really coordinate and be fluid. I think you need more hierarchy. We probably can look at a lot of just like organizational theory stuff that has worked in traditional companies, because I think that we can learn a lot from that. And
Yeah.
a lot of the mistakes that sometimes we do in crypto is trying to reinvent the wheel on everything.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there are some really tried and true kind of principles of how you organize people. And we don't necessarily need to kind of change that in a meaningful way. The nice thing about all of this is that everything is really transparent. How people vote, it's a very public forum. I think anyone in the community can come in and express their opinion, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to have influence on product development.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But I think that I take comfort in the last thing I'll say is what is perhaps the most exciting principle of Web3 or open source networks is that talent is discovered faster, because while you may have hierarchy, I think it just surfaces and percolates much faster, because if you're really smart or passionate and or smart, and you put forth a proposal and you start you got to believe that it is going to be easier for that individual to kind of be discovered. And I think you've
Mm-hmm.
seen that a lot of like the core members of, for instance, so many protocols started off as just community members, and then they were hired full time. And so I think that's pretty cool, which is, you do have some hierarchy, but a lot of the kind of end nodes have more autonomy to do stuff and to surface information because they're closest to it. And so it's not to say that it's fully distributed and, full autonomy to these nodes in the system, but at some point, I think there's more transparency, and the key there is because there is more transparency, there's more accountability. And so that I think is how DAOs work. But I would say that a lot of DAOs are going to struggle to really coordinate and keep people engaged.
Mm-hmm.
So we'll
No,
see.
I agree with you, and maybe I'll share on the screen. I did put together in a video pretty recently a proposed overhaul, if you will, for DAOs specific to gaming. So it's a little bit. I think it would be difficult to apply for a non-gaming project, but the big risk that I see with the way it's structured today is currently only token holders have a say in most of these DAOs, and I think that addresses one of the important pillars, which is that the investors in the projects need to have the ability to weigh in and give feedback to the core decisions. The other thing, though, that I think this provides us the ability to do is create loops where the people that are actually playing the game, instead of in Web2 space where the only avenue that you have for participation is angrily posting on Reddit and on Discord servers, you actually have the ability now with tokens, in this case primarily NFTs, to be able to engage in a meaningful governance structure. And so, I see a lot of projects likely moving to some type of a, as you said, more hierarchical structure where you've got people that are really involved in the gameplay that have opinions on it that are in most cases going to be meaningful and worth listening to. You have people that are in the community, whether they're influencers and content creators or marketers or these infrastructure providers that we need to keep building up in Web3 gaming. And they also need to be able to have a say in how projects develop. So I certainly see that we're going to need different structures to evolve more fully. And I do think that taking an approach that's similar to what we've seen in traditional projects and traditional organizational structures could be helpful for the furtherance of DAOs in general.
Yeah, I really like this. And as you said, I think the key here is a DeFi DAO is different than a gaming DAO, and but yeah, the challenge. I think the exciting thing is, in done correctly, I think users become more forthcoming, perhaps, and willing to share and be a part of, feeding information to the core team, and being very vocal around testing products and being part of betas, and because there is this sense of like ownership that I think is really powerful. Anyone can say, well, how is that any really different from owning like Apple stock? And I think it is. I think you feel it because
it's meaningfully different.
I think it is. And so anyways.
Yeah, no, I think being able to watch your feedback be taken into account, and frankly just purely responded to is a good first step by people that have influence, right? When I think we've all had the experience, you call a company and you've had a problem with their product or their service, and the first thing they tell you is your call is important to us, and then 45 minutes later, after you're done waiting on hold and then just give up, it's pretty clear how important your call is to them. And the access that you get now to founders and development teams and builders for all these projects is, I think, the other element that pairs with the ability to actually have a meaningful vote for these decisions to make that ownership feel more democratic and more transparent.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So, we talked a little bit before we kicked off the cast here about the evolution of Web3 gaming. And, I know I think you mentioned you passed on Axie, but you were involved in StepIn and some of the other projects over the past couple of years that have launched. I think some of that first wave was essentially an expanded pilot or, test case of the technology to work. And obviously, we saw some tokenomics that were unsustainable. I like to say that really this first wave was the gamification of DeFi protocols. But I think as challenging as some of those outcomes were, this really proved the concept could work in a very meaningful way. So, as you're working with founders today, do you see the industry moving away from this play to earn model and really embracing more, whether it's play and earn, play to own, or do you still see people that are trying to fight that first generation battle?
No, I think you're absolutely right on the money there, which is, and Brooks, when I interviewed him and I guess first talked to him, I think we lose sight of, but a game, the core definition of a game is it needs to be fun to play. So even if you're not earning anything, people just like to do it. And when you look at people that are playing World of Warcraft, a lot of them don't have to they're not doing it to anything other than, it's like professional athletes. At some point they do it because they love the sport. They probably could have retired 10 years earlier, but they just love it. And I think that's a key criteria. So yeah, I definitely think that, look, earning is like, you could argue that a yield farm like Yam was like a video game and it was fun. And it was like, similar to like, I don't know, like Animal Crossing or whatever. I don't, but I think there is a more focus on now. You look at like how Kieran from Bloom has been very public at saying, until we build a game that is at feature parity on gameplay, game lore, as a Web2 game, we're not going to stop. We're not going to win. And I think that is the right mindset to say we first need to focus on building a really immersive, just killer game that is fun to play. And I think that does twofold. One, really focus. Everything else sort of balances out because if you have a game that is fun to play, it attracts spenders. Whereas most of the games right now are purely attracting earners. I mean, if it is no different than a lot of these Web2 startups that have been failed and have broken unit economics, because if you throw a $5 bill on the street, people are going to come pick it up. If you give people free Uber rides or free food delivery, for a month or a week, they're going to try it out. That doesn't mean that your product's successful.
Right.
And so in a similar manner, I think, when you see the price of what they're earning really compressed, that's the litmus test. Says, is this game, are people actually sticking around here because they like the game, or they just have a potential to earn? In the same way that you see mercenary capital across DeFi, they just try to chase the most kind of juicy farm, if you will. And a lot of that kind of fizzled out quickly. Look, DeFi rates are lower than traditional market rates. So,
Yes, yeah.
here we are.
That's right.
And so, yeah, I think you need to have spenders to build a very sustainable game economy. And I think it's nice because a lot of these games, I think the right teams that I like are ones that that are well capitalized and are focused on that. And look, games take time to build. 2-3 years. So we need to be patient.
Yeah.
There's a whole category you could argue of like hyper casual games that are faster to develop, but by and large, I think they need to be fun and engaging. And if they're not, no amount of financial engineering is gonna fix a crappy product.
Yeah, that's for sure, right? And we see, I think we see a number of games that have the potential to surpass their Web2 competitors, and I think that's going to be a requirement. And we know from academic studies, I think Harvard did one 7 or 8 years ago, where they found that to compel someone to switch from one product to another, it actually requires almost an order of magnitude improvement in the second product, because you overweight by a factor of 3 the cost of losing whatever that product or service you have today, and you underweight by a factor of 3 the additional value the new product is going to give you. And so I think having asset ownership in these games definitely gets you part of the way there. But from a feature, from a gameplay, compelling mechanics standpoint, you've got to be better than your competitors. I don't think even parity is going to be enough to overcome some of those initial concerns. Now, it may get you enough of a user base to kind of build out that runway further, and then they're going to be convincing their guild mates and their gamer friends from prior titles to make the switch over. But you've got to at least be able to convince a substantial number to try it out, and that means you've got to have something pretty compelling.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, it's sort of, if it's a feature parity or just a fun game, people you need to sort of think, okay, what's going to be this idea of the viral coefficient, which is okay, and you hit certain critical mass, whether it's 100,000, 200,000 users, and then it gets really the flywheel of like, people go to their friends like, wait a minute, guys, like, why are you playing Fortnite when you can come and play game X or Y, Illuvium or whatever? And I think you saw that with Steppen. And anecdotally, a lot of people that historically have been critical on crypto, don't really understand it, they were reaching out to me and said, hey, I've been using this app and I could earn these NFTs and shoes, and it's so fun. And a lot of them were like not necessarily focused on like the price of GMT. They were just like, oh, this is like Strava, but it's really fun. And I think now twice, instead of like taking an Uber to the restaurant, I'm going to walk. And you insert yourself in that flow. It's just, I'm studied game theory, and I love this idea of, incentives can really change and just nudge people in the right way. And it's what's so fascinating for me about this movement is it's really kind of interesting that you can design like systems with kind of better incentives to really kind of change human behavior. Now, I think the operating assumption should be, as you said, humans, and changing human behavior is really, really hard. So you're better off kind of assuming that humans are not going to change their behavior. And designing systems that kind of work, assuming that's going to be the case. Alongside, and then obviously like do powerful kind of incentives. So, yeah, that I think is pretty exciting.
For sure, and I think really the Web3 gaming has the easiest route to do that. Maybe besides finance, right? We've already got DeFi that's in place, and for me, that was part of my thesis and why I've gotten so involved in the space. Is I see the allure of gaming as as a genre of content in the entertainment industry that's pretty easy to see that transition of NFTs and on-chain assets to make sense because of how the Web2 structure is set up, where this is one of really the only hobbies that I can think of that you can pay hundreds or thousands of dollars to engage in. You can spend hours of your time, and then you have no ownership and control of what you produce. If you're a photographer or you're a gardener or you're a carpenter, you like working out, in all of those cases, you maintain the rewards or the value that you produce from your hobbies. In gaming, this is one of the only hobbies where that's not really the case, and so I think you've got an easy on ramp to convince people for that. I think it was last week on the Empire cast where you and Jason talked about some different asset types, and you asked him what did he think was going to lead the next bull market in crypto, and I was interesting because he never actually asked you back. So I'm going to take advantage of his miss and ask you, what is Web3 gaming, or are there other sectors of crypto that you think are going to drive the next round of bull market growth in the industry?
Probabilistically, I think there's a higher chance than not that a game is going to kind of catalyze this new movement. Look, whether asset prices reflect that, I'm
sure.
thinking more of users, because I think
Adoption.
I can't think of a network that has attracted so many users and has generated meaningful value. You think about Facebook when it was doing its IPO, a lot of people didn't really understand the model, even the earlier rounds of Facebook. Yerney Miller, who's like a fantastic investor, and he was fortunate enough to have looked at a lot of data in Russia about Yandex and how you could monetize social networks in an interesting way, and looked at Facebook and said, wow, there's something here. And other people, traditional Silicon Valley VCs, didn't really have that insight. And so he came in and bid like twice the valuation on the Facebook Series A or something. And so I think in a similar manner, like I feel like people are in this environment where they lose track of how powerful gaming really is, how quickly games can scale and attract millions of users to play a game. And so my thesis is, you already have a pretty robust and solid infrastructure on L1s, and L2s increasingly kind of are giving us early indications that look at Arbitrum, look at Optimism, even Polygon to some extent, like things are there that I think they have economies of scale. Like it becomes cheaper for these L2s to get more users and on a number of fronts. So I think that's going to coincide nicely with a game that has been in development for 2-3 years, hits the market, people love it, play it. And then like, if you have that attention, then what's stopping that particular game from rolling out and building all other products, including their own chain? Now, you kind of saw early indications with Bored Ape and Yuga Labs. But I think the challenge there is that there's only 10,000 Bored Apes. And in order to join this club, you need to shell out a couple $100,000. That's a hard kind of proposition to go mainstream. And maybe part of their thinking was with the Ape coin, you kind of onboard more people and they feel part of it. But I think it's kind of you're telling people, no, you're like not in the great OG club. It's hard. Whereas I think a lot of the teams that I look to now are thinking, hey, what kind of, like in the discussions around like Louvetards and some of this stuff, it's like, let's really design that thinking there's going to be like millions of people, like thinking in abundance, not scarcity, not 10,000 NFTs. No. The metric here shouldn't be, is X NFT going to be worth so much and people are going to be, super happy? No, it's, how can we create that the incremental users that not joins today, but joins in 2, 3, 4 years is equally motivated and feels like he's really part of it and is not going to be dissuaded by this crazy prices, And so, yeah, look, you saw this, and I've said it before, is you kind of saw this in China and Asia generally has given us really good cues of how the world is going to develop, like especially in finance, right? And even social networks. Like what happened with WeChat, I think was a fantastic phenomenon. Whereas like finance is really antiquated in the Western world, like people still go to a brick and mortar bank, But now in Asia, like it just blurred all of it. Like WeChat started with chat, social, so pervasive, right? It captured your attention. And then they built out an entire ecosystem of their own version of Netflix and Uber Eats and literally everything, right? And so it became this everything app. And I sort of think that that's going to be the case for a Web3 game. As an example, Steppen became became the number one most popular kind of app. It started in Solana, and then they migrated to other chains, and now their marketplace is the number one marketplace. Like overnight, became the number one marketplace in the Solana ecosystem, just because they have the users. And so again, you say, okay, well, what's really stopping them from building out other things, forking a particular code and then just building their own? I mean, they started off with a wallet, but like think of a normal game. It attracts hundreds of thousands, like thousands of users. Then they build their wallet. Then they build maybe their own version of a marketplace, and they just do it. And so I think that really is going to probably be like the winning kind of application. I did a poll yesterday on Twitter, and the question was like, where do you think, the question was like, what part of the stack will accrue the most amount of value in the next cycle? And the options were like a settlement layer, that's an L1 or an L2, apps, whether it's DeFi, games, aggregators like wallets like Argent and Rainbow Wallet and some of these others, and or other. And the number one choice was on 46% said apps. Which is kind of like different because historically, yeah, like it sort of, maybe you would have thought aggregators, because in traditional tech, aggregators have been perhaps like the most successful. So, yeah.
Yeah, and I think part of this may be because DeFi and GameFi, any products launching on the blockchain are by definition less sticky, because it's easier to transition into and out of these projects. I suspect that's part of the reason that people are assuming, you've got to have a major app that's going to draw much of the value to it. I do wonder though about the longevity, because frankly, it's difficult to build a community, but it's even more difficult to maintain a community focused on, whether we talk about a game or regular communication. If you're sort of a social group, it's difficult to maintain those for an extended time period. And so, I do think that you have the risk that some of these projects, they may be wildly successful and they may have a short shelf life, because as soon as the community decides, well, you know what, we don't really like the direction that things are going, it's easy for them to pack up and leave, because they can immediately liquidate all of their assets. You've got sort of the sunk cost fallacy that keeps people in Web 2 games for a lot longer than they often like playing. And sometimes it's because the community they're part of, which is still going to be true in Web 3. But the other case is because they can't do anything with all of their virtual goods. And that barrier to leave goes away entirely in Web3. And so I do wonder about the longevity. I think the DAO structures are important to have that stronger sense of involvement and engagement with the projects, because you lose some of that stickiness that exists in Web 2.
Yeah, I think there's still going to be some stickiness on the margin. Like certainly the barriers to entry and exit are much lower, whether you can just fork a code and build your own, like copycat in another network. If you're a dev or as a gamer, like you could just move to, I don't know, another game. If the team is not doing the things that, you feel like betrayed, or, the team's just moving in a direction that you don't like, then you can move. Guess you could sell the NFT. But people, I think, have this idea of having digital ownership gives is probably that stickiness element that it's going to be interesting to observe over time, like how powerful that is. Because historically, as you know, games have super high churn, and they have a very the half-life is such that they have huge success for a month or two, and then they die off. And it's the engagement piece that is super difficult. You look at like Zynga, for instance, and how it sort of becomes this like this never-ending struggle of you need to put out the next hit and the next hit and the next hit. And it's tough because like a lot of these games derive like 95. It's like a super high power, like high square distribution, whatever you want to think about it. Like 90, I want to say like 98, 99% of the revenue comes from like the like less than 1% of the user base that is like playing Candy Crush, for instance. And so it's super challenging in the Web2, in traditional gaming development, and kind of just that has been the hardest thing for a studio to kind of keep users engaged and motivated. And I think go ahead.
Yeah, but I think this is fixed to some degree, not solved, but it's improved in Web3 because in the past, you only had the ability to sell, whether they were in-game assets or it was access to the game or gameplay loops or whatever, to whales essentially in these games, because as you said, they're the ones that are funding. Usually it's the top 1% or 0.5% are, like you said, funding 90% of the overall earnings for these games. Now with secondary marketplaces, you don't have to sell only to whales. As long as you have people playing the game and you have item churn and transitioning and trading within that ecosystem, if you're able to recapture some of those secondary fees, you can fund an entire ecosystem that way. Imagine if WoW made money on every transaction in the auction house, if it was 1%, and those were actual real world assets and you were exchanging it on Ethereum or whatever. This would be, they wouldn't need to charge $15 a month, right? No. That would have been a totally antiquated model that no one would even consider.
Yeah. Yeah, that's what I keep telling. Like, I think that no surprise you see someone like Mark Pincus, who was founder and CEO of Zynga. Like, I mean, he has a punk on as a PFP, and I think he's been vocal around like this exactly what you said, which is, wow, like there is something here that is, I think, can meaningfully transform the relationship between the gamer and the game studio, and that's really powerful, I think. In a way, I think it solves a lot of the retention issues where people feel more vested and involved in the project. And it's kind of paradoxical to think that because it's easier to leave, they won't. But I think it's partially true because you just feel like you have more freedom. And then so you're more engaged. And I think as is true with crypto in general, like if you're a developer, like having strong, immutable guarantees that you're not going to get rugged, that they're not going to ban you from the app store for no good reason, without explanation, that the economic terms are fair, transparent, better than Web 2 is night and day, right? And so that you're not going to have the game studio just discontinue the game, mint more swords. These are things that sometimes happen. And I think, having the certainty that, it's not going to, because they can't upgrade the code, they can't change it unless the community agrees on it, then I think that's really powerful. I think gamers are very passionate people, and when you have these kind of guarantees, it's like so I don't know when it's going to happen, but I think it will happen, where just the majority of the gaming industry and world wakes up to, like, users, gamers will now expect to have a meaningful, like, more freedom, more ownership. And if you're not giving it to them, it's going to be near impossible to compete against a game that does. In the same way that you're probably going to see this with artists, and you're already seeing it already, right? Where if you're either doing music NFTs or just traditional art or whatever, I think it's just like, when you create content right now, you're absolutely at the mercy and whims of these kind of like duopoly, or, like TikTok and Instagram and YouTube. And it's a very unfair model, and you don't really have much of a choice. It's just like, they have the distribution, they have the users, they exert the terms, and you're at their mercy. And there is some competition, of course, because TikTok comes in and they compete against Instagram, they compete against YouTube, but nonetheless, I mean, it's still very difficult. But Web3 shifts the balance of power over to the people that deserve it the most, which is the creators. And I think that's kind of really powerful, in the similar matter of gamers, right? And I think that, I'm not saying that it should be a meaningful, radical transformation where most of the benefit accrues to the gamer, but to some extent, I mean, a lot of value that you're creating for social networks and games is derived from the user and the gamer, and so like there should be some change. And I think we're going to have a pretty big aha moment where you hit some critical mass where the industry just says, yeah, I think we're not going to go back to the old model. And now the question is, I don't really have a good answer to this. I don't know if you do, which is, can traditional game studios like Fortnites of the world, Nintendo and whatnot, make some transition into Web3? And what does that look like? I've been asked this question. I don't kind of know. I don't have a good answer, but I don't know if you've thought about
Yeah.
it and do.
Yeah, I have. Actually, we had an interesting discussion on Aluva Talks about this type of concept recently. So I think there's a scenario, and for me, it's 70-75% where basically the entire industry moves to this way of thinking that if you aren't giving ownership of assets in some meaningful way, you're not going to be able to compete. And so it's sort of the winner take all with the philosophy. That this is going to be the case, and I'm on record as saying that's my base case, that's my expectation. 10 years from now, if you're a game developer and you're not giving actual ownership, meaning right to own, right to use, right to trade, to sell to your players, people are going to regard you as basically stealing their virtual property because they've worked hard, they've paid for it, and they've earned it. We obviously don't exist there, but I think in the next decade that will be the case. There's some, in my mind, 5-10% scenario where this doesn't work out, and it's because we're not able to figure out economic structures that don't break the gaming side of things, and then we're never able to move beyond sort of the financialized approach where it's always number go up is the baseline. Again, I don't think that's the case, but I admit that there exists some possibility it could happen.
Yeah.
I do think there's also some other percentage where it might not be winner take all with the approach. And in my mind, this could be genre specific, where there are some genres of games where you're not really playing the meta game. And so therefore having persistent assets isn't really meaningful, right? And I think of something like a first-person shooter, and for sure you can have different strength of guns and different types of weapons that you might want to collect, but that's not quite as meaningful as like a 4X or strategy game or an RPG for saying I have asset ownership, because in that instant you also want to have competitiveness within that round with other people that you're playing. And so there's the potential that you may not be able to create a meaningful structure, at least in the midterm, to where that's possible. And so I see some genres as maybe not fully evolving to this model. The question of studios, I think that we'll see these big current powers in Web 2 gaming evolve slowly. And I think it's going to take to wave 3. And for me, that's like 2026, 2027 time period, where they're going to need to see several different types of games and different genres capture the public's imagination over the next few years before they're willing to actually consider upending their business models. And I don't actually see them moving towards a blockchain future. I see them basically taking the fiat on-ramps and structures and saying, okay, we'll give you the right to sell your things on our marketplace. I don't think they're going to ever be willing to relinquish control of their own marketplace for selling and maintaining assets. I don't think you're going to see your Fortnite skins on OpenSea ever. Is my personal belief.
That's hard. Yeah, it's definitely interesting for them to make this pivot. Historically, incumbents have struggled to transition. And history doesn't treat them necessarily very well when there's a huge kind of paradigm shift, but we'll see.
Yeah, for sure. Agreed. So I think part of that is the vision and the mindset of the leaders for these organizations, and they're beholden to their current shareholders, right? If you're creating something new, your early investors matter a lot, but in general, you don't have constituents that you have to answer to. So it's easier to some degree if you're building from scratch than on a closed ecosystem. So with that in mind, I know you talk to a lot of these founders, and in the early stages, you've shared that their vision is important to you when deciding who to invest with. What else do you focus on in these pre-seed and early seed rounds for gaming studios that you're looking at?
It's a great question. It's sort of evolving, but my criteria, number one is, do they have the experience or the vision or the kind of the unique insight, because sometimes they may not have had it or worked on a particular, like look at Hayden from Uniswap. He was not like a financial wizard, if you will. He taught himself how to code, but he had an idea to build an AMM, which is initially kind of conceived by Vitalik and posted by him. And then he took that and then ran with it. And look, you built Uniswap. And I think sometimes when you're in these high innovation spaces, whether you look at like medical discoveries over time, like penicillin, like they happen by accident, but it's really not an accident. It is your that I think a lot of times it takes someone that is not super deep in a particular field, but is smart and passionate to come in and say, what if we tried doing this? And most people laugh at it, because you would have thought, take Uniswap again as an example. And I know we're talking about DeFi, this should be more like gaming, but nonetheless, you look at an AMM and people in traditional financial markets would say, Sam, for instance, from FTX on the record saying, AMMs are not as efficient as order book models. They're never going to work. It's dumb. And i.e., if you were to ascribe to that type of thinking, you would have A, never built it, B, never have invested in it. But I think sometimes it takes an understanding that what does this technology really enable, and then believe in that, and then saying, okay, let's run with that. And I think what people perhaps failed to realize was that an AMM is a super powerful new model that allows anyone to be a market maker without a huge balance sheet, without much sophistication, to be an LP. And it just allows more consumer preference, because there is this idea of impermanent loss, absolutely, but you might be indifferent between getting more ETH or USDC because they kind of cost average your way down if you want it or not. And so, and while that you're earning fees. And so I think that happens time and time again throughout history. That sometimes people that are not super deep in a particular domain end up discovering by accident. And I think it's not really accident, it's just intellectual curiosity and this idea that maybe we can do things differently. And I think a lot of the founders that I meet are really passionate or ticked off because it's like there's a lot of friction. Like, why can't we do things in finance that just finance hasn't caught up to the internet? You don't have an Amazon like fluid experience with finance when you're sending wire transfer, remittance, payment, whatever. It sucks. And I think the best founders just have this maniacal endeavor of saying, I will, until this changes, I will not stop. And I think and this really shows in this type of market environment, which is, it's not a full bull bear raging bull. And I think the best founders I want to understand are these people going to be here through and through and build through any market condition and really inspire and hire smarter people. And look at what has happened in Illuvium. When I met Kieran, Kane called me and said, oh, my brother's going to start this game. Finally, he's going to move into crypto. And I talked to him, and Kieran was not a veteran in gaming, but he had the passion. His brother, of course, was a creative in his own right and had a ton of experience, but the combo works and they're super competitive. And I think that DNA is an absolute requirement in this space, which is ruthlessly competitive, while also you need to inspire people to come work for you. So can you be a leader? And Illuvium, every time I talked to Kieran, he was like, yeah, I hired the team doubled in size every other month. It's felt like, and that's super powerful. Like, there's a lot of talent in the Illuvium team. And so that's great. And other times, of course, you meet a founder like Brooks that is just a true savant, and just you feel it. I mean, his firepower and his passion is it's like when you hear Elon talk or Vitalik talk, I mean, you just get the sense that these people are just in a different dimension and you want to be a part of that, whatever they do. But yeah, that's mostly what I look at. It's just mostly intuition after just, meeting so many founders that I think the question is like, would I rather pick like, there's always like this is a classic question, which is, would you rather pick a A+ team in a not so big market, or would you pick like a B+ team in a massive market? And I don't know, because I think that assumes that you're going to know how big these markets are. And I think that's a very tricky assumption to make, because no one kind of really expected I think you always kind of invariably get wrong, either being too optimistic or too pessimistic about the size of the market.
Hmm.
And assuming that I'm going to be able to size up the market is something that I don't believe to be true.
Hmm.
And so I kind of tend to perhaps focus more on, is this founder going to be able to pivot, iterate, not give up, inspire other people to come work with them? Because I get the feeling that we're super early in crypto still. And forget about sizing up these markets. Okay, you can think about gaming. You look at the analog. Okay, Web2 game is massive. Fortnite is cranking out X month. We kind of can look at these data points to suggest that Web3 game is going to be massive. Or financial markets. I mean, derivative markets. Like, these are massive markets. But that's not to say that it's going to be one-to-one translation. Sometimes the one that benefits the most is the consumer, and all those fees that existed in the first place shouldn't have existed. And it just goes to like
That's true.
consumer preference. But I think, again, where I take most stock is, if you build something that people love, I can't think of a product that hasn't accrued meaningful value.
Hmm.
And I think that starts and ends with raw talent that is super passionate and is going to be able to inspire other people to come work and iterate and make it work.
Hmm.
So I don't know if that answers the question, but
yeah, it does. I think it all. I also would question that sometimes being able to distinguish an A plus and a B plus team might be a challenge as well, because frankly,
absolutely.
someone that's an A plus team today might have a great picture of the world as it exists currently, but may also be slower to learn and iterate. And I think this is one of the most
Absolutely.
critical elements in a space as nascent as we are today. You're going to see so many of these founders because it in many cases it's a copycat industry like everything else. If you find something that works, you all of a sudden don't need to expend your resources and energy trying to develop that same thing and apply it to your project. Just port over whatever those components are. And so I think honestly, a lot of the teams that I'm really excited about are ones that recognize they don't have all the answers today, but they're heavily involved in the ecosystem and in learning what are other people doing that's working and that's not working, and figuring out how is this relevant, or is it relevant for what I and my team are building today, and pivoting where necessary.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's such a good point. There's a great book by what is it? Only the Paranoid Survive, by Andrew Grove. I think it was the early days of IBM. I don't like fully agree with everything he says, but I think the principle is true, which goes to what you're saying, which is I think the best teams are just paranoid, because I think about IBM.
Yeah.
The rate of innovation back then, look, I wasn't even alive, so okay. But I try to read this great book called How the Internet Happened, and just history, I think, is instructive, because I want to understand if people back then had this feeling that I think is that we're just moving at the fastest pace of innovation in the history of humanity. Because and so I want to understand if they felt that back then. So my my intuition is that, you had to be paranoid back then. You have to be 10 times more paranoid now. And when I say paranoid, I say it in the sense of, to your point, which is, you need to be adaptable. Yes, you need to have a thesis. You need to be strong. You need to have a vision. And sometimes the world is wrong and you're right, and then the world catches up to your vision. Fine. But you also need to be hyper kind of vigilant on trends, and being like anti-fragile in the sense of the word, which is, crypto is, anyone can, in an open source environment, anyone can copy what you're doing. I think the thing that really makes you win and stand out is you're just faster than others in adapting, in hiring talent. And so I think like the pace of innovation is like unlike anything we've seen before. It's probably going to continue to accelerate because you just have the distribution of the internet, and information is flowing at a pace that is unprecedented. And so I think you need to be, I don't know, like I'm speaking here out of turn, because I'm not, like, I've tried to be a builder. I suck at it. I just rather invest in people. But yeah, I think it must be really difficult. My sense is that if you're a founder in crypto, it's hard not to pay attention to what's going on elsewhere. And it's also can be really demoralizing when, going back to the example of Hayden, he's building Uniswap, and then comes Sushi, Master Chef, forks the code, launch a token, and It's like, okay, like it could be it's frustrating, right?
Mhm.
Where do you draw the line between Newton's standpoint, which is everything we do, we're standing on the shoulders of giants, versus no, this guy's just really just copying my
Yeah.
stuff. Like
Yeah.
it's and then what does that
Where's
mean?
where's the
Like
IP? Yeah.
where's
Yeah.
the IP, and what does IP really mean in this open source world? And it's a challenge.
Mhm.
This is why I say it's like really hard to build in this space. And the fact that really talented, smart, successful people want to come, I'm like, guys, are you really sure you want to do this?
Mhm.
But it is, I think, again, it goes back to this core principle that humans are social species, and everything in open source is really fun. And also, by this kind of, I think, culmination of like this mega trend that people are just really frustrated with centralized institutions.
Mhm.
And for a number of reasons, the inequality that continues to grow in places like even the US and elsewhere, and the lack of just, across a number of dimensions, health organizations and financial markets, and everything over the last 10, 20 years has suggested that, like, there is a lot of mistrust in centralized institutions and providers. And so, you know yeah, a ramble, but
Yeah.
I think it's inspiring, because again, the smartest people I think want to work in open source
Mhm.
systems versus closed ones. This is like the cathedral. And I've dropped 3 books here, but the last one is the Cathedral and the Bazaar, or the Bazaar and the Cathedral, which is really good on just general open source.
Oh, for sure. And I agree with you. I think the pace of change is faster now than it's been, and you can look at a few reasons why. One is certainly the spread of communication, and communicating is now easier. And honestly, it's not just sharing information, but it's curating that information to receive what you're interested in. We needed a lot of those infrastructure tools, not just to be able to electronically and pretty freely communicate, but to get to the point where we could gain access to the information that we wanted from what essentially is all of human knowledge and info that's available to us. And now I think with the token structure, the ease of financialization, where for the first time in history, anyone that wants to can create their own non-sovereign currency is just absolutely a game changer as well. And so I
Yeah.
agree. I think both of those in conjunction mean that we have no idea what the next 10 or 15 years is going to look like, but you've got to
Let
be
alone the
fast.
next 5.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah, for
Those that
sure. I
don't even
agree.
go that far. But yeah, no, the way that I think value is accruing, and the challenges of historically traditional open source, has been continuity of development and incentivizing people to continue to build and maintaining these systems. And a lot of it has just been subsidized by, honestly, Google and Netflix and these places that allow their engineers to kind of spend idle time once a week to just tinker with projects. And but I think it's disingenuous, or unfeasible to think that people are going to do things. I believe the humans are good-natured species by overwhelming majority. There's a few rare examples where that's not the case, but by and large, people want to do good, and it feels good to do things. Sometimes you mentioned Harvard study. There's so many studies also in Harvard and other places where behavioral economics, which is sometimes people do things out of their good heart and good naturedness. And when you introduce a financial incentive, it kind of breaks people. People
Mhm.
feel like it's like charity, right?
Yeah.
Um, but in open source, I think what is really exciting about what you mentioned now in tokens is this idea that value can accrue to every contributor in a more equitable manner. And I think that's really, really powerful. It's like open source on steroids. And I'm not asking you to believe in like Bitcoin as a alternative in digital gold, or Ethereum as a de facto settlement layer of the internet. I'm just saying, how could you not be as excited, because now you have a way to really monetize and make open source so sustainable, or more sustainable. And yeah, Linux and founders of the internet didn't accrue much value, like the founders, if you will, founding fathers. But had crypto been around back then, they would, in a much more meaningful way, like Vitalik
Mhm.
House and or core contributors of the Ethereum blockchain, or Solana, or some of these other projects. And I think that's really exciting. It's really exciting.
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. I'm really can't wait to see it. This is one of the main reasons why I've elected to be in this space. I know you're the same, and certainly for me, Web3 gaming, I've said, is the gateway drug to decentralization,
Yes.
and that's one of the main reasons that I'm here. Is you stay for the game, you come for the games, and you're going to stay for the philosophy, and I think having embraced that is going to be beneficial for for humanity, not just for the gamers. That's just it's an avenue to help people think about how we interact with organizations and companies and each other.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. That's spot on, I think.
Very good. Well, Santi, I really appreciate the time. Any final thoughts you want to leave with our audience today?
No, other than maybe just impress on people that you don't have to be an engineer to add value and contribute meaningfully to this movement. And I'm just going to keep saying that because a lot of people might just find it daunting that they don't know about zero knowledge proofs or cryptography or distributed systems. This is the most disciplinary, like cross-disciplinary, multidisciplinary industry that you can think of. And we probably over-index on engineers, and we need more people about like experts on like organizational theory, sociology, anthropology, psychology, like all. And I think what's really exciting is, people ask, how can I get started? And I'm like, well, pick a project or two that you love and go to their Discord and just poke around and ask questions. Everyone at some point started from ground zero, and it's never too late to start it. We're so early. And so the fact that we have had and are continuously not afraid to experiment as an industry is one of the more powerful kind of core principles. And I think that is telling you that we are very early and things, it's unfortunate that sometimes break, and when things break in crypto, they're just pretty bad. They're not like, like, but nonetheless, I feel like, that I think to me is I take the criticism. We need to find more utility. We need to build more enduring things, killer products. Fine. Yeah. We've been sort of in this infrastructure deployment phase for so long, but I think now is a time to kind of start focusing on, and I'm optimistic of building things higher up in the stack and really cool apps. And we're going to get there. I see it because I'm talking all day to founders, and the founders that are coming to this space to build, given all the uncertainty, all the kind of friction that still it's hard. It's really impressive and encouraging. And so, yeah, that's probably the parting thought. Anyone listening, I think if you're a builder, if you're just interested in the space, use it. Use this technology. And I think it's hard. You should always be skeptical for sure and careful and diligent, but I think it removes a lot of like being cynical. It's hard to be a cynic when you try out this technology and really play around with it and tinker with it. And so, yeah, we're all kind of beta testers anyway. So
yeah, maybe still alpha
fun.
version. It depends on your time horizon. Yeah,
but it's fun. So anyways, no, I really enjoyed this discussion, and thank you so much for everything that you do. I mean, just in Illuvium and other places, really a big fan of your work. And so thanks for having me on. I really enjoyed this discussion.
Thank you. Appreciate it. And definitely for our listeners, make sure you go out and check out Santi on social media. I'll have the links in the description below for him and where you can find him. And I'll just echo what he said. If you have interest in the space, pick some of the projects, pick some of the influencers and founders and builders that you want to get involved in. And there's no better time than right now in the middle of a down market. Everyone's got an easier access channel to all these individuals in the space. So take advantage of them if you can.
Definitely.
Very good.
Awesome.
Thank you, Santi. Appreciate it. And,
thank you. It was great to be here. Yeah. Thanks so much for having me on.
For sure. And have a great day, everyone.
You too. Thanks, everyone.